Using food to cope with stress is not something to be ashamed of. However, it can become problematic very, very quickly. And if you use food to soothe some stress and you're noticing that you're starting to gain weight but you don't know what to do about it, then this video is for you. Hi, my name is Clara. I'm a sport and exercise psychologist and a fitness coach, and I help my clients learn how to feel better within themselves so they can break out of the self-sabotaging all or nothing patterns that they often find themselves stuck in relation to their health and their fitness behaviors. And in this video, I'm going to talk to you a bit about why stress leads to stress eating and what you can do to stop it. And no, I'm not going to tell you to just be more disciplined or just be more controlled, because I'm not an asshole. And I know it's maybe not super customary for psychologists to say that, but it needs saying. So what's actually going on? The world that we live in means that so many of us are contending with a huge amount of stress, and nobody's really telling us or teaching us how to manage that stress in a way that is appropriate or proportional to the stress levels that we're experiencing. Now, in psychology, when we talk about stress, what we're often referring to is when our coping abilities do not match the demands that we're experiencing in that moment. So the demands significantly exceed our perceived coping abilities and capacities, and that's when we start to feel stressed. Now, stress can come in a million different shapes and forms, and this is not necessarily a video about stress, but this is a video about how we actually cope with that stress and how and when food can become a really helpful way of coping with that stress that very quickly becomes unhelpful. Because here's the reality, food is genuinely a helpful strategy for coping with stress, because what food does is it helps us feel more regulated. It helps us soothe our nervous system. And that's not just me talking shit, that is genuinely evolution. Think about babies, think about infants. What is one of the things that parents do when an infant is crying? They feed it, because very often an expression of distress is appeased or can be soothed by eating or by nourishing oneself or by receiving nourishment in the case of an infant. So our nervous system has evolved over millennia to be regulated and soothed through food. And that is a good thing. That is not a bad thing at all. And the fact that us now as modern human beings, as adults, the fact that we're able to know and recognize that food is self-soothing is incredibly helpful. Especially because when we're stuck in our fight or flight or freeze or flop system, our threat system, one of the most tangible ways to get out of that in the absence of any other tool is to eat. That will activate our rest and digest system, our soothe system. And so even without us having to deploy any cognitive skill in eating, we can automatically, quite quickly, take ourselves out of that fight or flight system. However, as humans, we have tricky brains, and those tricky brains mean that in observing ourselves eating to self-soothe, we can activate, our mind can activate socially absorbed rules and norms about what we should be or shouldn't be eating, which can invoke a feeling of guilt, a feeling of shame, which automatically puts us back into feeling in that threat state or kind of being in that fight or flight mode. And that leads to a very, very tricky loop that is incredibly easy to get tangled up in and very difficult to pull out of, because the more stressed you feel in the absence of any other tools, the more likely you are to use food to regulate. But the more you use food to regulate, the more stressed you're going to feel, especially because, of course, in only ever relying on food to soothe or to reduce stress, it is likely that somebody might find themselves very quickly gaining weight, especially because the types of foods that we have access to these days are quite high in calories, and the types of foods that we might access in feeding stress are far more likely to be those foods that are higher in calories, because they are typically far more palatable and far easier to overconsume, far less satiating because they don't have much fiber, which is typically the thing that fills us up, which again puts us in a position in which the more stressed we are, the more likely we are to eat more food. The more food we eat, the more shame we might experience in observing ourselves eating that food. The more shame we experience, the more food we want to eat, and the more food we eat, the more likely we are to end up gaining weight. The more weight we gain, the more shame we feel, and this cycle can repeat itself over and over and over again. Now, not every single person who finds themselves struggling with this cycle is likely to develop a disordered relationship with food. However, the longer someone finds themselves in that position, the higher that risk becomes. And again, this is my reminder to you that that is not your fault. It is literally because you have a tricky brain. We all have a tricky brain that we didn't choose, that has simply evolved over time to put us in a position in which we're soothing from an inordinate amount of stress that we're experiencing in the modern world, never mind like just in our jobs, financially, the globe, the world, everything that's going on. And we're finding ourselves relying on food, which is very palatable, very accessible to us right now, to be able to compensate with that. And again, all of this comes into the context of the fat-phobic world that we live in, that again discriminates quite heavily against people who do carry more weight, but more generally has this kind of like moral and ethics imposed upon us, so that we feel almost like socially absorbed, that makes us feel shame and guilt for eating. And again, the more shame and guilt we feel, the more we have to soothe from that. So again, this is not your fault. This is simply a result of a lot of factors that you have no choice or have had no control over, which again makes it very difficult to know where the hell to go in order to break out of that cycle and be able to move forward. And this is exactly the predicament that so many of my clients find themselves in when they start working with me. And I remember this one particular client who came to me expressing exactly that. They've noticed that they gain a significant amount of weight as a result of experiencing a lot of stress within their lives. What they noticed was that they'd started to cope with that stress only using food, and that then the more food they ate, the more stressed they were, because not only were they then contending with the stress of life that had already been there to begin with, that had instigated that first moment of eating, but now they were also starting to get stressed because they were observing themselves feel out of control around food, and they were starting to gain weight as a result of that, which was then, in spite of their best efforts, in spite of them telling themselves every single night that they would do better the next day, they were finding themselves still struggling and finding themselves eating more, and that relationship was slowly and steadily spiraling out of control. And the way I described it to them was a bit like quicksands. It was almost like the harder they were trying to change, the more difficult it was becoming, and the further deep they were sinking within those quicksands, within that struggle of trying to control their food intake, but finding out the more they try to control it, the more they try to control their stress eating, the more stressed they were becoming, and the more they were eating as a result of that. And as much as this client came to work with me because they wanted support with intentional weight loss, the first and most important thing that we did was actually start to work on their stress, start to better understand their stress management, start to develop some tangible tools that were genuinely going to help them self-regulate in the presence of stress, supporting them in developing a better distress tolerance, a better ability to sit and contend with that stress. And we also started to nurture and develop their own sense of self-esteem and their self-compassion, because what was happening for this client was that every single time that they were eating in response to stress, they were adding even more, as if that wasn't already enough, they were adding even more pressure in the form of self-criticism. And so what we started to do was start to learn to sit with the shame and guilt that was coming up for them whenever they noticed themselves eating in response to stress. And instead of responding straight away with shame, we started to be able to hold space for that and started to learn ways that they could actually nurture themselves more, be a bit kinder to themselves, even if everything within them was telling them that they should insult themselves, that they should try to be really strict with themselves and reinitiate whatever diet or whatever effort they were putting into not gaining weight the next day, which was obviously the quicksands repeating itself again. So again, although this client presented to me having gained a significant amount of weight in a short period of time and observing themselves consistently binge eating, the reality was that they had a problem with stress, and they had a problem with their self-esteem and their absence of self-compassion, instead of necessarily it being a binge eating disorder, so to speak. Now, what a generic fitness coach would have done would have been to observe this client was persistently overeating. They would have probably given them a pretty rigid plan to follow. They would have told them to eat at structured times of the day, and they would have hoped for the best. And it's likely that if this fitness coach was particularly bad, that they would have probably told my client to be more disciplined, to experience and apply more self-control day to day whenever they find themselves in the presence of food, to try and remember their why without really giving any substance as to what the hell that means or how to bring that to mind. Or maybe they would have just chucked a couple of like breathing exercises their way, or tell them how to surf the urge. Again, varying degrees of utility, but overall not very helpful for this type of client. Because to be honest, it's quite insulting to just say to somebody who's really struggling to control themselves around food to just be more disciplined, as if they're not trying. And like I said, it's the trying of the discipline that is making that problem worse. It's the quicksands. The more you fight them, the deeper you sink. So if you're finding yourself stress eating and noticing that it's leading you to binge persistently and you can't stop doing that, and yet the harder you try, the more stressed you are and the more you end up binge eating, a generic fitness coach is not going to be enough to help support you through that challenge and actually overcoming it without just putting a band-aid over it. They won't be able to help you, but I can. And thankfully, because my clients chose to work with me, I was able to help them too. By focusing on supporting them in developing better coping strategies for their stress, not just coping strategies that I think are going to work because they've worked for me in my personal life, but actual evidence-based strategies that are known to help, that I can tailor to that particular individual, so that we can gradually start to help them manage those moments of big emotions in which they would maybe automatically reach for food, or maybe go into a bit of a trance while they're eating, so they can genuinely disconnect from what's happening in the day-to-day life or from the difficult emotions that they're experiencing. And also we started to develop some of those skills to be able to be at least more neutral, less self-critical, and gradually more self-compassionate, building their own self-esteem so they could redevelop that sense of self-trust within themselves, because they weren't consistently attacking themselves every single time that they observe themselves eating in response to stress and doing something that they shouldn't be doing. And that client, like all the others that choose to work with me, was able to learn how to stop binge eating and actually stop gaining weight and move towards intentional weight loss without it triggering or risking the development of disordered eating or the exacerbation of what was already starting to look like disordered eating, because we were able to focus on stress management and on the development of a better self-esteem and a more unconditional sense of self-compassion. And they were able to do that and move towards intentional weight loss in a compassionate and a sustainable way because they made the choice to work with someone like myself, who's a psychologist and a fitness coach. And if you head to the link in the description, you'll be able to do exactly the same thing by filling out my inquiry form and applying to work with me. Remember, stress eating and binge eating and feeling out of control of food is not going to be solved simply by signing up to an 8-week fat loss program where someone prescribes you macros and tells you to go to the gym 5 times a week. What you need is someone who can support you with your training, who can give you nutritional guidance, absolutely, but who is also trained and qualified to be able to support you in developing some of those core stress management strategies and some of those core principles of self-esteem and self-compassion, because that is a real root of the problem, and unless you address those things, you will end up remaining stuck. Thanks so much for watching the video. As always, I hope you found it helpful. I hope you found it informative. If you did, make sure to give the video a like, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.